Welcome, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast, coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and produced by Markel Consulting, LLC. I'm your host, Dave Markel. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's much-anticipated episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. This is episode 14, and I say much anticipated because of our special guests, Nicole Florisi and Kliem. They are both well-known experts in a multitude of areas that are particularly suited to what this podcast is all about, bringing justice to victims. Nicole and Vaughn start off by talking about the importance of being trauma-informed, from both a law enforcement perspective and from the perspective of victims and survivors. Our conversation led nicely into the area of expertise that they are both deeply involved in at this point in their careers, the science of the use of force in the law enforcement profession. Keep listening, because that discussion led into a comparison and contrast of how much of the same areas of focus for understanding, investigating, and responding to those use of force aspects bridge into how sexual assault and rape cases are investigated. The interview is a lively, compelling, and informative collage of topics that will have an impact on everyone who listens in. I promise that. And at the end of this week's episode, you'll be anxiously awaiting next week's conclusion of this two-part series. Thanks for tuning in. Now get ready for part one of an extraordinary interview of two extraordinary experts. Enjoy the show. Welcome, Vaughn and Nicole. Thank you for being here. I'm going to ask both of you to tell my SAS audience a little bit about yourselves. So let's start with Nicole. If you just kind of introduce yourself and tell us about your experiences and your past and what you're doing now.
All right. My name is Nicole Florisi. My current role is I am a law enforcement subject matter expert with VirTra. They are a law enforcement and military simulator company and do simulated event training. However, I work in training curriculum and I kind of hit both sides of the house. So I do some stuff on the simulator side, but I'm currently working in learning management systems so we can deliver training through phones, tablets, and computers and whatnot that is equally as immersive. So I do that. They're very flexible with my schedule. I have a great boss, which allows me also to, of course, instruct for force science. So I teach in their de-escalation program, and I'm very lucky to do that. I was a police officer for 20 years. I'm still a sworn officer part-time. I wasn't really ready to give up my cert, so I kept it. They're going to have to pry it out of my cold, dead hands because I'm not giving it up. So I'm really lucky. I kept it with a small town in Arizona called Jerome, Arizona. It's a little historic mining town. But I have kind of a varied background. So I have a background in mental health. My master's degree is in professional counseling. I've worked as a crisis and trauma therapist. All my postmaster's work is in trauma counseling and human factor psychology. Part of what I want to do is marry up the two sides of human performance and the behavior so we can be more well-rounded in law enforcement. So that's one of the things I really enjoy is I can kind of get the balance of both sides. And then because I'm a glutton for punishment, I just started my doctorate a couple months ago. Well, 1 month ago now in clinical psychology. So
congratulations.
Yeah, well, I don't know yet. Congratulate me if I finish the dissertation and pass.
Just starting.
Yeah.
That's a big step.
It's huge. So, so that's kind of what I'm doing. And, I'm a big fan of communication and decision making. And I just think that I'm very, very lucky with all the relationships I've built, with Vaughn, like here at Force Science. This is how I got to meet you. And I mean, this is just really robust. And I'm just very excited to be here. And thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, thank you. I'm the one who's appreciative for sure to have you guys both here. Thanks for filling us in. Vaughn, it's been a long time.
Honestly, I think I look back at some of the experiences I've had and the times we spent together on the road training and there at Fort Leonard Wood training. We were innovating. We were a part of something that was brand new in the sexual assault investigations and prosecution world. And I look back on that time and I value it. It was some great people and some great experiences.
For sure.
So I'm Kliem. I'm director of the consulting division at Force Science. I am a former police officer. I did that from 93 to 03 full-time, where I ran our communications program, our de-escalation program, our use of force program, which was all integrated. Worked a lot of gangs and drugs, but what it may be more relevant is I started out also as a crisis counselor, and I had hundreds of hours of crisis counseling training before I was ever a police officer, and I was able to translate that into our de-escalation and communication programs. After 9/11, I joined the military as an attorney. So there was a little bit of a transition there. I had a bachelor's in crime and delinquency studies, master's in criminal justice administration, and then I got my Juris Doctorate, my law degree. So I wanted to hit the ground running, join the military with my law degree as a JAG, but throughout that career, I continued to specialize in police legal advising, use of force, policy development and training. And of course, I was a prosecutor in the military, is where you and I met. And so I got to specialize in sexual assault investigations and prosecution, and was part of the early forensic interviewing program, trauma-informed interviewing principles, which is incredibly important. As we talk, I think your audience will recognize that what we learn about interacting with sexual assault victims and how to engage them during the investigations and interview process, those same principles and concepts and approaches and strategies are vital to how we're interacting with police officers who've been involved in critical incidents and other victims. We're focused on force encounters right now, but the lessons certainly apply across the board. What I ended up where I landed at Force Science as a litigation consultant is I've worked hard to develop expertise in police use of force decision-making, in police practices, in law, obviously related to force encounters and Fourth Amendment issues, video examination, and human factors application. So I'm an advanced force science specialist, as is Nicole. So what that means is we went through a 17-week program. After attending the week-long certification program, we did an additional 17 weeks in understanding human factors as they apply to force encounters. So that would be not just action versus reaction type stuff, but we looked very, very deeply at the psychological, physiological, and environmental influences on decision-making and performance during force encounters. And that's for both police and civilian populations. So that's how I ended up as a litigation consultant. I just sort of drew all those experiences together. And now we're involved in almost every high-profile case in the country on one side or the other. And I remind people that it's almost first come, first serve, because our analysis does not change, whether we're being asked to look at the police performance for a plaintiff's counsel or for a prosecutor, or if we're asked to defend cops. The analysis is going to be the same. It's just how those clients decide to use our expertise is what changes. Maybe a nice segue is Nicole and I were asked to speak for the Wounded Blue Conference. It's a program or an organization run by or headed by Randy Sutton out of Las Vegas. And what Randy noticed was that police officers who are involved in critical incidents, the aftermath during that recovery and rehabilitation phase, where they may be in a hospital, they may be unemployed or underemployed, their bills don't go away. The support system can't go away. And so what Randy and the Wounded Blue did was put together an organization that is supporting police officers during that critical transition phase. Either they're going back to work or they'll never go back to work. And they support them with, psychiatric resources. They support them financially. They just make sure they don't feel like they're alone. And so it's an amazing organization. Nicole and I were asked to teach a short seminar earlier this year for the Wounded Blue. I think it was Terre Haute. Is that right? Where we ended up? Terre Haute, Indiana. What we discovered was the way that police officers are being interviewed following a critical incident. There are still way too many police organizations that are making the same mistakes we were making with sexual assault victims, the types of chronological interviewing approaches. I know we're going to talk more about this, and I want to really hear from Nicole. And so I'll just say they weren't trauma-informed. They weren't reflective of the reality of the critical incidents experience. And so now what we've done is we've been able to start to slowly develop some momentum in training the investigators to take those lessons that we learned in sexual assault investigations and start applying those to other critical incidents.
My response is, wow. It's amazing that there's finally some science that is finally being applied in ways that are helping cops being victims in these types of situations, but they really are.
I kind of think that's how you have to look at it. At the end of the day, I mean, this is really what it boils down to. Trauma is processed on a very micro individual level, and we all know that. That's going to come down to an individual's coping skills, resiliency, support system, or not. But my perspective is from a macro viewpoint, we need to understand that officer-involved shootings, other critical incidents, seeing horrible accidents, SIDS deaths, drowning, homicides, all the violent crime that officers are subjected to by choice of their job. From a macro view, that is a traumatic event. It is a critical incident. We just tend to root in trauma blindness when it comes to, well, you chose this job, therefore it doesn't apply. And that's not really how the brain works. But the individual processing really comes down to just that, the individual, right? And some people are either better equipped, different skill sets, where it does not impact them as much in a negative manner. But I think the conversation needs to come from the top is a critical incident is a traumatic event, and how can we best support whomever is going through it? Sexual assault victim, violent crime victim, first responder, EMS. Let's be honest, as the list goes down, domestic violence advocates, sexual assault advocates, therapists, psychologists. I mean, it's yeah, you bet. Yeah, definitely don't forget communications personnel who are kind of left out of the loop, sometimes with zero closure. They don't know what's going on. It's hard to create your own closure in a traumatic event if nobody provides you a support system to learn how to do that. So that's really kind of how Vaughn and I got this conversation started. We're trying to figure out how can we marry up. And other people, it's not just he and I, but this is like where we're at right now. This is really important because we're starting to see such negative impacts just from, and I would just say it's just a lack of education, perhaps. You know, you only know what you know. I don't want to say it's a deliberate intent for interviews to go astray or anything like that, but until the information is there, until the information is provided and people have the chance to learn it, they're only going to do things the way they know how and the way they think is best. And best might not be, you know, so we just need to figure out how we can move forward. And you kind of hit the nail on the head with the science. The science is there and it doesn't disappear when we put the badge on. And violence is violence is violence, and the brain is the brain is the brain. And we need to understand that those concepts that impact the civilian population and the military population will impact first responders too.
Absolutely. This isn't intriguing to me, an approach that I think I vaguely kind of had a concept of when Vaughn and I first met and we started talking about being trauma informed, but to see how far it's come in the last 10, 12 years is kind of amazing. Obviously not fast enough because like you alluded to, Vaughn, there's a lot of the same mistakes still being made. But just quickly, go ahead. Let
me talk to that real quick. Yeah, there is a new generation of investigators every day. We are never going to be done training and reinforming and sensitizing. And so we all make the mistake as veteran trainers of looking back and go, we've been teaching this since the 90s. We've been teaching this since 2000. How is it not caught on? And the answer is our investigators were working the street. They were focused on what we would call the 5-meter target. They were learning their job. They were on patrol. That's where they were at. They weren't doing the investigations. And as they promote into those positions, that is an entire new generation of investigators who we wouldn't have really expected to have been anything that other than maybe just tangentially exposed to these concepts. Maybe through domestic violence training, if they had great trainers, they would talk about trauma-informed interviewing or, you know, being sensitive to the psychological and physiological effects of crisis. And so it's never going to go away. And so I've stopped beating us up over like, how do they not get it yet? And I've stopped beating up the profession. It's never going to go away. And we're always going to have to stay fully engaged in what I would say is stewarding yesterday's lessons, best lessons of yesterday to the next generation of investigators. And to do that enthusiastically, that's my lens right now. So we talked about whether somebody's a victim or not. Trauma-informed interviewing doesn't even require us to make that conclusion. It's just a human who we need to realistically expect that during the incident, there was a human involved in that incident who had psychological and physiological responses to that experience. And I didn't know if Nicole or I will get to it first, but I'm going to go ahead and say it. You know, Dave, you've heard us say it many times that the people involved in critical incidents are not witnessing the event, right? They're experiencing the event. And that experience is what we want the investigators to be sensitive to and to have a deep, sophisticated understanding of, so they know how to frame their questions, so they know how to realistically manage expectations relative to the types of information they're going to be able to derive from the people who are involved in those critical incidents, whether we want to call them victims or participants.
I mean, I would even say non-survivors would probably be the best term because that's what they've done. And I mean, no interview process, when you really think about it, whether it's from a therapy perspective, psychology, or interviewer, no part of that should ever be able to force victimhood on anyone. like some of the macro view of how, trauma and traumatic stress and impacts on the brain are a separate issue. Wording wise, my preference, would always be for, regardless of what type of crime it is, we're dealing with people who are survivors and they've navigated that path. But it's not to really put any type of perpetual victimhood on anyone, and nor should any interviewer be in that position. I think the bigger conversation is really what Vaughn is hitting on. These are human beings. The brain works a certain way. The only thing that really is a difference or a buffer is resiliency and coping and grit and whatever that looks like. And what are we, honestly, it's not even both sides of the table. This is a 360 conversation. What are we doing to be supportive in all areas for individual coping skills, for destigmatizing the processes, for helping people as a whole, civilians included, understand the limitations of human performance and the fact that the badge is not a shield against science. It doesn't deflect the science. And there's this fallacy of basically superhumanity when it comes to trauma and exposure and critical incidents, that just for the sheer fact of choosing this job, it makes you resilient. And we all know that's not the case. Resiliency comes from a much different place. The same with the military. There's many, many military members who have fantastic and absolute amazing resiliency skills. And then there's some who maybe didn't have the exposure to that. But the thing is, this is the important step, because talking is the first step, but doing is right after that, because we've been talking for a long time and talking doesn't change it. It's doing, it's integration, it's putting it in the training process. And we have a lot of great leadership buy-in across the country for officer mental health and wellness. But so does the military when you think about it from their perspective. But the suicide numbers aren't dropping. The depression numbers aren't dropping. Anxiety, post-traumatic stress, none of that is really eliminated, right? So it has to be a lot more of an immersive conversation than we can talk about it and talk about how great the research is. It has to be, what are we doing to provide the support and integration so there's actual changes? And I think that is probably the biggest piece of the conversation that really needs to be hand delivered. And that's to the instructors and coaches and trainers, across the country to really marry that up in their departments.
Yeah. For my listeners, just for a quick second, I'd like to hear from both of you your definition of what it means to be trauma informed.
Well, to me, it's the understanding that a human involved in trauma in any critical incident is going to experience predictable psychological and physiological responses to that trauma. And that trauma is going to not only affect how they respond during the incident, it's going to affect their ability to remember the incident after the fact, and it's going to influence their physiology after the fact, their sleep patterns, the physiological responses relative to tremors, to being dizzy, to being overwhelmed, to having all those normal, expected, predictable responses that not any one person might experience, but that you should be aware people may experience, and that it's normal, not just survivable, but it is absolutely, you can come out of it stronger and you can come out of it more capable, more resilient. And I'll make this point as I pass over to Nicole. We talk about victims, we talk about survivors. In both sexual assault and policing, there's another category. I know there's many categories, but those who excel, there's those people who just absolutely dominated the event, whether they beat off their attacker in a civilian on civilian case, whether it's a police officer who dominated that threat. It's okay. They're still going to have experienced physiological responses to that event. Yep. And it doesn't mean that there was anything wrong with them. We want them to be resilient and to dominate that event when they can. We have to keep bringing that up because we do not want particular police officers, or any civilian really, or any citizen, but we want to empower and motivate and encourage police officers that even in their humanity, they can be tough. They can dominate. They can excel and still be human. Point I made at our last conference, I'll make it again. Knowing how you're going to respond to a critical incident or types of physiological responses and psychological responses, knowing that list isn't going to prevent it from happening. Right. It might mitigate your response. It might make it easier and be like, oh, okay, that's normal. That happens. And you don't have that downward spiral, that cycle. There's something wrong with me. I shouldn't be in this job, So understanding the normalcy of the experience certainly is going to mitigate your response, a negative response, but it's not going to eliminate the experience. And so I just keep making that point because we can have really, really high functioning operators, very resilient operators, who just had a bad night. they were just tired. They had something happened at home. And so we want to prepare those guys and those ladies to recognize that even they can have a bad night and they can come right back from it. We want to continue to see the human and all of its complexities. I think that's my answer to what is trauma informed.
And I could just say I second everything Vaughn says, but I could probably go a little deeper. I think it's a responsibility, to be honest, to understand the neurobiology of trauma in this role, because it is woven into the very fabric of what we do on both sides. And so if we just don't have even a basic understanding of that, we're just not going to be able to do our job as effectively and efficiently as we could. So understanding the neurobiology of trauma, what Vaughn talked about, understanding the psychological and physiological responses that accompany it, normalizing those responses is huge. The critical events, the officer-involved shootings, the sexual assaults that we see, the violent crime, those are technically abnormal events, even though they can be frequent events. That's not the normalcy of human nature. Well, that could be a whole different podcast on the violence of human nature, I suppose. But the bottom line is, the responses you have to an abnormal situation are normal, and they can be varied, and they're going to be individualistic, even though they fit a set of parameters, And so normalizing that, making it okay. I think it's very important that everybody gets comfortable with the fact that we can talk about emotion and it's okay, that we need to learn to understand triggers, that we need to understand how to manage that, that we need to really embrace stress inoculation. And not stress exposure. I know that sometimes is a ping pong match between people and semantics and wording, but if stress exposure worked, I can tell you this, there wouldn't be a suicide in the military or police world, period. There wouldn't be a suicide anywhere, because everybody's exposed to stress every single day. It's not exposure. It's what do you bring to the table with it? And so understanding that you can absolutely grow, but one of my platforms that I really think is important is the prevention of post-traumatic stress injury, the prevention of it ahead of time, that we're helping officers build that resiliency before they encounter a critical event. Because a lot of people, I don't think, have a deep enough conversation that post-traumatic stress injury is preventable, and past that, it is manageable. So we need to support. This is such a robust conversation when it comes to being trauma informed. We need to understand prevention. We need to understand support. We need to understand growth. We need to understand all of that. And we need to deliver it with a message of hope and recovery. And that's the bottom line, because no officer, and this is where I do sound like I get on a soapbox, to be honest, no officer, first responder, and I include military in this, nobody who chooses, service above self, for me, deserves to eat a bullet at the end of that career. You would take a bullet for somebody who would piss on you if you were on fire. You would give your life for something greater than you, a higher purpose. And the end result of that shouldn't be depression and anxiety and adjustment issues and trauma and stress and crappy family lives and bad relationships. We deserve to thrive. All of us, really all human beings that have that exposure. This isn't just relegated to the, first responder world by any means. And so that, by proxy, to me, is part of the reason it's so important to really embrace, the trauma-informed platform and be supportive and compassionate with what we're doing, but that falls on the individual. And that's part of the conversation I think we need to have. The agency may not provide that training, right? So if you have an officer's life in your hands, a career, that a decision you make can potentially be, career ending for someone based on your perception, wouldn't you want to have the right education, training, foundation, something to understand that robustly? And so at some point, where it's like, my agency should do it for me. No argument from me. Agency should be supportive in training. But at the end of the day, it comes down to you. And I think that's part of the obligation of being trauma informed. It has to be a choice for you to seek that knowledge out so you can be better at what you're doing.
Yeah, I like you brought up the chronic piece too. It goes beyond the incident, and again, you can know what the symptoms are going to be or what the physiological responses or psychological responses might be during the incident. But do you know what's going to happen a week later, 2 weeks later? Do you know you're not going to particularly sleep, or you might wake up experiencing the event, or maybe you don't, right? The other piece of that is, like I mentioned earlier, knowing the physiological responses isn't necessarily going to prevent them from happening. but also knowing how to engage in a resilient lifestyle doesn't make you resilient. You have to do the exercise. You have to do the mindfulness. You have to do the breathing. You have to change the context. Or, you, Nicole, have such a great skill set in the reframing and I think the MDR and the bilateral, I'm going to butcher the programmatic response, but or therapy, but all of that goes into the trauma informed. And it's a little interesting, Dave, when we looked at this from the sexual assault world, we were almost always looking at it like, how would the target of the assault respond, right? What could we reasonably expect from them in an interview room? How much could we reasonably expect them to want to cooperate after the fact, in those weeks and months afterwards? And, force encounters view, we're looking at it. What was the officer able to perceive during the threat assessment? What were they able to process? Was it rational decision-making or the fast and frugal sort of system one, heuristic decision-making or intuitive decision-making? We look at how we can hold an officer accountable, to what degree we can hold an officer accountable who's involved in a critical incident, who's involved in ongoing trauma and injury and fear. And so part of trauma-informed, it marries up really nicely with this idea of human factors application, because if you look at the study of human factors, there's one aspect with that all of these events, there's just a human involved with their uncertainty, with their fears, with their lack of predictability. And we have to overlay that because we know the outcome and they didn't, right? We know how things turned out. So when we question their judgment, we always have to remember they didn't know the outcome, and they brought in with them their fears, their confidence or lack of confidence. And there's just a human involved. And then there's the other human factors that we've been discussing more, the psychological and physiological responses that affect perception and memory and decision-making. That's very different. But it's also no less human factors. And so I think Nicole did a great job of reminding us that trauma-informed isn't just understanding the event. It's understanding and managing expectations relative to the people involved in those events weeks and months later, even through recovery, therapy, resiliency. And then I think somebody in this room will ultimately get to recognizing our role on the other side of the table, and how trauma-informed may also neatly capture how the vicarious trauma, the secondary trauma. Nicole's got a brilliant class on empathy, which we can spend hours talking about her class on empathy. And when I talk about Nicole and empathy, I'll put it in air quotes, because she has a very different approach, and I think an incredibly healthy and important approach to what type of empathy we bring into an interview room and bring to those cases.
My immediate question that comes to mind, and I think to a lot of the listeners that are hearing this too, why isn't being trauma-informed and how to talk from a trauma-informed perspective to everyone, not just victims and survivors, but witnesses and even perpetrators? Why aren't we teaching this at the onset, very beginning in law enforcement careers at the academies? I was just in Baltimore, asked a group of Baltimore investigators how many of them, by a show of hands, had been through a course on how to interview victims, and not one hand went up. And that's still the case. There's tons of courses out there on how to interview suspects, right? You learn in the FTO program in law enforcement, the field training program, how to interview witnesses. I mean, it's just by observation. You learn what questions asked. But why isn't trauma-informed instructed and taught the neuroscience that we're talking about here and the psychophysiological issues being talked about more in academies?
I would think, and I think Vaughn may agree with me on this, part of it, unfortunately, although I think we need to morph our thinking, it's a time constraint issue. How many weeks do you have at the academy? What's already mandated? How much more can you add? I think it's a much bigger, important conversation, because what you're hitting something on the head that is probably the bigger part. You have to really think about trauma-informed interviewing we don't want to focus it on victims, right? It is for human beings. And how many of your suspects are victims, in the same interviewing techniques apply across the board. It shouldn't be about how to interview a suspect and be a hard ass and, rearrange your room to the chairs and the door and the this and the that. You know what I mean? It needs to be about what is the best way to read human behavior quickly and accurately to get the best interview. Trauma-informed platform, I think, is just not as widely accepted yet. And it's been, I say yet, and I think we're growing, but I think it's looked at almost too specialized of a tool. Like it's an advanced skill. And while it will take time to learn, I don't look at it as an advanced skill. That's part of the thing. I think that needs to be the foundation of the interview process, period. That just is going to take, I think, a different lens to look through from an academy, because we focus more on interrogation methods and interview methods. I think in the academy, Vaughn, you can give me your input on that, but it's not really about interview. It's about interrogation. But you can elicit truth and elicit confessions with a trauma-informed platform with all the right questions framed appropriately with whomever you're talking to. And you even said with eyewitnesses that we could have a whole nother podcast, right, on the reliability of eyewitness testimony, right? What impacts it? Well, the questioning styles, right? How we do it. So it's applicable across the board, but I think it's time, budget, what's in the state statute for what is mandatory learning already. Sometimes it takes a minute to get that changed. And by a minute, I mean a lot longer, because the curriculum is set, sometimes, and then it just ends up, oh, you're going to get more exposure to that once you're out of the academy, and then the exposure doesn't come. Vaughn, what do you think?
Yeah. And the more we talk about it, the more it's human informed. I'm just thinking about witnesses, particularly perception, attention, perception, cognition, memory, all integrate, whether you're in trauma or not. You can be across the street watching it, and tunnel vision and auditory exclusion and all of the perception cognition issues are going to apply whether you're under stress or not. And we've been pushing that in a lot of our force science classes, that we're under some illusion, or we have allowed the misperception that tunnel vision, for example, only occurs when you're under stress and you're hyper focused on the most salient stimulus, which is most dangerous to you. And I go, well, actually, no. If you're looking at your teacher and during a lecture and you're taking notes, you're probably likely experiencing tunnel vision relative to the selective attention, and the peripheral sort of fades off, and you're not going to be so attuned to it. We know this. We've all looked at our phones and texted, and we're unable to see the road, and so I think human informed is helpful relative to this early training stuff, just to recognize what each of those cadets or recruits and early police officers and early investigators have experienced their whole life apply to other humans. We want to sensitize them, like remember that. So I don't think it takes a lot of high level sophisticated training. And I'm fleshing this out after you answered the question, because I think my initial position is I spent hundreds of hours in crisis counseling training before I was allowed to talk to another human on the phone. Right? We send cops to 24 hours at most of communication training in the academy, and then send them out to multitask in open environments where they have to do threat assessments, risk assessments, communication, active listening, de-escalation, note-taking. All of that has to occur. And Dr. Lewinsky will keep pointing out problem solving. They're not just doing all those things. They're actually taking in sufficient information that they can engage in the cognitive process that requires a lot of attention and a lot of cognitive load to problem solve. And so I think, we put them behind the eight ball. And now we're going to add to that trauma-informed or human-informed interviewing. And we might start them out with a script, right? Open-ended, non-leading questions. Like, can we do that? Just open-ended introduction, set the context, open-ended, non-leading questions. And they may not know why it works and what pitfalls they're avoiding by doing that. But if we can sort of script the initial approach, maybe we advance it a little bit. But ultimately, Dave, we've been through so much training. Nicole and I have been through so much training to deep dive these issues, as I know you have, Dave. And, Nicole knows the neurobiology of the processes that are occurring that might result in the suppression of peripheral information versus the highlighting of central visual information. Maybe they don't need that deep dive, but since we've got it, now we're sort of like, the more they know, the better they'll be at these jobs, the easier they'll avoid the pitfalls. But I think finding that balance between how much do they need to go to a 17-week force science course to be advanced specialists before they can do a trauma-informed interview,
No, any amount of exposure, almost, even if they took the initial interview class that they have in the academy, or like I say, interrogation class, you could probably, in my opinion, give somebody a foundation in about 2 hours. You could tell them, don't use leading questions. These are examples. And this is the challenge with law enforcement training. We don't like hypothetical constructs. We want a script. They need something to practice. And I get that it's relevant to the amount of time we have. So it's hard to give somebody a construct, but if we can give them examples, and there's some great examples online or in handbooks and references, even with, I think, if they knew nothing else, but these questioning styles will better suit you. And here's some examples of questions. You could start there for sure. I'm always like, hey, never pass up an opportunity to train. And then the more you get, the better, gives you a more robust platform. That's also individualistic in nature. And when people get voluntold to go to training and stuff, and it doesn't really pique their interest, it's a little bit harder sell. But with this type of interviewing, though, once even some of the basic skills are learned, you see the return very quickly.
Right.
You see the return because you see the conversations engaged. So I would agree that we don't need to send everybody to, the most in-depth training. But to me, I think it just comes more from a responsibility aspect. Like, do you want to have enough knowledge to be able to do your job effectively? And that falls on us individually.
I think I made this point before. I'm not sure, but remember when we're doing an interview, if it's a forensic interview, that means we're trying to collect evidence worthy of submission to a court, right? Mm-hmm. That's different than counseling. It's different than therapy. It's different. Mm-hmm. It's different reason for why we're listening. It's different reason for why we do feeling reflections. It's a different reason why we loop back to something earlier. Tell me more about that, right, Dave? What I am convinced of is why this might take more time than we would like is when I conduct a forensic interview now, or trauma-informed interview, and I'm doing it from the perspective of a force encounter, I'm listening for elements of the offense, which means I have to have a pretty sophisticated understanding of the criminal offenses that are being investigated and that need to be met. I'm also doing it from a human factor standpoint. For example, when I hear someone say, I just wanted it to stop, I was thinking, like, is this guy going to stop? And I was just hoping the guy would stop. What I'm hearing is an internal focus of attention. Somebody was in their own head during the incident. And we know when we look at NIDIFR's quadrant of attention, there's internal and external, narrow and broad in the 4 quadrants. And if somebody's telling me during an interview, I'm just hearing it, and I didn't ask about it. They didn't know to tell me, but I was just hoping that guy would drop the gun. I was just hoping he'd stop shooting. I'm now keying in on a fact, because of human factors training, that this guy internally focused is less likely to be recognizing a change in the external environment, like a dropping of a gun or a turning of a body or a backdrop that has changed. And so these sorts of things in an investigation for a force encounter matter to me, because now I'm managing my expectation on what this officer might reasonably be expected to remember, because I've cued in on his focus of attention. And so the same thing happens with sexual assault investigations. As you remember, we would use the example, Dave, of the victim who was counting ceiling tiles, right? Counting the holes in the ceiling tile, or looking at the doll on the shelf. And
the dissociative issues. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so if you're not sophisticated enough in the human factors, broadly speaking, if you're not sophisticated enough in the elements of the offense, if you're not sophisticated enough in police practices, you really aren't going to know where to take that interview with your follow-up questions. Now, open-ended non-leading means they get to set context and they get to drive their experience, right? The memory of that experience. Right. But our follow-up questions, artfully crafted. I say that because it's not a perfect. I've had people I've interviewed, I've done a feeling reflection and said, sounds like you were pissed. Or I said, sounds like you're irritated. And they're like, no, I'm effing pissed. And you're like, okay, I missed on that one. Right. I undershot that.
Yeah.
But the same thing is, I do think that if you take a brand new recruit and you teach them the script, the open-ended non-leading, and with some feeling reflection, then you're just getting them started down the path of sensitizing that there is a right way, and we're going to grow you towards that. There's no listening to an expert in police practices, use of force decision making, human factors, conduct that same interview is going to be very, very different. And so I do think it can take time to do it really well. And I think Nicole maybe have the same, well, all of us on this podcast, I think would have the same experience where we're going to be reading the interview after the fact or watching the video of the interview after the fact going, oh, I want to go back. I want to go do this interview. Yeah. He's leaving so much on the table, right? Or what one of my favorite slides is shut up and let me talk. like we might be watching it, throwing stuff at the screen saying, would the interviewer please stop talking? This guy has a story to tell and we'd like to hear it.
Yeah, that's a huge point for sure. That's one of my little bones to pick on interviews is if you want to get, a narrative truth and a perspective, what we really commonly don't teach along with any script for trauma-informed interviewing is to actively listen. Listening is a participatory process and you have to engage in it. And we don't commonly, if you want to say, train for that. And so, instilling how important it is to be engaged in the process. And I think second to that, just because, research is looking at a lot of this stuff right now, is the believability factor. If you come across as you don't believe, and this is whomever, sexual assault victim, violent crime, first responder, law enforcement officer, critical event, or whatever, there's a lot of negative impacts that come from that. So Vaughn hit the perfect word, right? He said artfully crafted questions, right? But this type of interviewing is a craft. I mean, it truly is a craft. It's an art and it's a craft in its application. Because if there is something that's hinking you up, you don't want to convey that to somebody, or it may not even be something negative. You're just like, that doesn't make sense to me, and you're in your head. If that hits your face, you will destroy your interview. If you diminish that relationship from a believability foundation, the interview's done. And, there's a recent study that came out that was looking at the impact on sexual assault victims if they thought the police officer did not believe them during the interview process. And it was a small sample study, it was only 23 people, but the negative impacts were profound. Post-traumatic stress, limited healing, negative physical health impacts, choice not to report any additional assaults. I mean, now, obviously, first responders, a little different population relative to their critical incidents, but I want you to think about when we have put this time, effort, money, training into our law enforcement personnel, and then they're marginalized for the very act that we have trained them for. Their whole career, whether they've been on the road 5 minutes or 30 years, we marginalize them. And then somehow they're a liar, they're not believable. We put them in this box when this is what we have basically begged of you, that you could potentially give your life in the service of another, but knowing also you will have to take a life potentially in the course of your career, but now you're a problem. And then simultaneous to that is now, because you've done your job, you are just by proxy unfit for duty. I mean, this is such a multi-layered event to me from the law enforcement perspective that, it's just like an onion. You could just pick this apart forever. But I just want to, touch back to say, I think that believability factor in that interview is very, very pertinent. And a good interviewer needs to have that professional demeanor of engagement and respect, and regardless of how they feel. Regardless of that, and I'm sure Vaughn is kind of tired of this too. We're not beating up law enforcement profession, but when you see those almost like, I can't wait to catch you lying, those gotcha interviews, asking questions that are just really, they're beyond the limitation of an officer to answer. You can only remember something that's in an attentional window. You can't create a memory of something you never saw, heard, smelled, felt, tasted, And I think, I kind of went on a tangent a little bit there. I mean, all those layers fall into that, but that's no different than the same thing with our sexual assault victims. When you think about it, that we have to show belief in the process. If the investigation flushes out, God forbid, that there were, somebody was untruthful, whether sexual assault or in a critical incident, that will usually be flushed out with the rest of the investigation relative to the science. But if we don't understand the human psychology and human factors involved in those processes, we're going to think people are lying when they're not. And the prime example is linear and chronological memory.
Sure.
Which we've completely really, I think, embraced from a sexual assault perspective. It is the norm under traumatic stress. You don't remember in order. But why is then the officer faulted? And that's when I say the brain is the brain. Traumatic stress is traumatic stress. So why are we faulting officers for that same issue of you can't remember in order, you can't remember linear, you can't remember chronologically, and now you're a liar? When any other person we interview that would be a civilian side of things, now we know they're not a liar. The principles don't change just because you want them to.
There's so much to talk about. They have to start somewhere. Stop asking questions that a human would not reasonably be expected to answer. Like, how far were you, and how many fingers, and how many times did they punch you, and how many times did you punch them, and how many shots did you fire? In critical incidents, that is not what a human is typically focused on. And if their attention isn't focused on it, they're not going to perceive it, and they're not going to remember it, because there was nothing to remember, as Nicole says. And so one of the things we've really been pushing against in any of the arenas, and by the way, the segue, if it's not obvious, is as we're talking to these investigators about how they should be treating each other and the lessons learned from the sexual assault investigation arena, we are reinforcing that. Oh, and by the way, if you weren't aware of this, this is how you should be treating victims of sexual assault in your interviews as well. So we're giving.
Glad you brought that up.
We're giving them the benefit of the doubt that they have been sensitized to this, but we're fully aware that our audience is probably 90% have never done this and have never been exposed to these populations, and certainly may not have had the skill set or the knowledge to conduct trauma-informed or forensic interviewing. But we're going to talk to them as though they had, as we continue to go down the list of things they should be doing. They get to walk away with a new list, never having been ridiculed or embarrassed for not having known it. But we're simultaneously saying, hey, look, if it was good enough for the sexual assault folks, it's good enough for the police. If it was relevant to that population of human, it's relevant to the police. But you remember, Dave, when I was teaching, I would tell the investigators the opposite. I'd say, hey, cops, we already do this for you guys in police investigations. We're just asking you to take everything we know about police investigations and the psychological impacts that you're experiencing in a critical incident, because no one's pushing back. No cop is going to push back against that. We want you to recognize those and then apply those in this other context, this other population. Well, now we find ourselves coming full circle and saying, hey, you know what we know about sexual assault? And now let's apply that to cops. And we get it. That's why I said it's generational, and we're going to have to keep looking at our audiences and say, meet them where they're at. And if they're a bunch of selfless service duty first cops, we're going to say, hey, this stuff applies to you, and you will be the most sophisticated interview in the room. Oh, and by the way, it also applies in the sexual assault arena. And if we get those sexual assault investigators, we'll say, oh, yeah, all that stuff that you guys know about sexual assault investigations, let's start applying that to cops now. So it's not going to stop. But at some point, maybe not now, I'm going to turn it back to you, Dave. We don't want to have a stream of consciousness, but we want to talk at some point about the concept of betrayal and the effect of betrayal on both populations, police officers and sexual assault, and how betrayal can be communicated, because it's not always obvious, but the impact is huge. And so when we get a chance, I want to make a note to myself to talk about betrayal, because that's become a big part of Nicole and I's messaging.
I think that's a great place to go. In fact, it's one of the aspects of this whole interview that I started questioning, the betrayal/trust issues. So with a police officer going to work one morning knows, there's a potential I could get shot at. There's a potential I could have to shoot at someone. And so that pre-trauma mindset exists. And does that help that officer in that trauma situation, or a soldier, for instance? He knows he's going into theater. He may be shot at, may have to shoot at people, obviously. Does knowing that change the trauma impact?
That's a dicey one, Dave. No, I mean, legitimately, that you probably asked one of the most multi-layered, faceted questions of so far today with that one, to be honest.
The reason I ask that is because it's like death. Someday you're going to die. And so death isn't necessarily, it's traumatic for people to have a loved one die, but research shows being raped is more traumatic than finding a body or having someone close to you die. The impact is different. It can be much more severe. The post-trauma issue shoes. So I guess where my question is going, when we're talking about trust and betrayal, if we recognize that in sex assault, the victim knows the perpetrator 93% of the time, and the last thing they ever anticipated when they started, for instance, a relationship, that it happens in familial relationships also. But when we're talking about an intimate relationship, the last thing a victim thinks is that their significant other would sexually assault them.
Right. Well, and that's a multi-layered thing too, because I want you to think about the fact that there's the betrayal in the relationship itself, and let's leave the familial ones aside for just a second, because
Sure.
you're going down a whole road of like molestation, complex trauma, like how that translates into adulthood for just a second. Let's just like focus on adult survivors for just a minute. Of course, you're already talking about the act itself, and as we know, the basically number one event that creates a post-traumatic incident, if not managed, is sexual assault. And the violence of the assault isn't relative to whether the post-traumatic stress will occur. It could be, if we consider, I mean, they're all violent in the penetration aspect of it, but if there's no additional injuries, it's a singular event that can create post-traumatic stress symptoms. So there's the betrayal from the partner, and that is a separate issue. There is a lot of times, think about betrayal depending on culture. What's accepted within the culture, what has been normalized within the culture, what has been normalized within that family. Religious doctrines play into that, like whether it's appropriate to leave, to not leave. I mean, that's such a multi-layered event from sexual assault when it comes to betrayal. And then there's, was it a one-time thing? Did it end up in the honeymoon wheel? Is it, then we're back together, and then there's the apology. I mean, domestic violence is so complicated. I was running a domestic violence and sexual assault center for a couple of years. And, it was hard sometimes for advocates to wrap their brain around that the people who would stay were the ones that needed the most help. They weren't ready to leave. And, changing that mindset was very difficult. And that translates to police officers too, because they want these logical, linear, rational answers. Why are you still here? Why haven't you left? What does that look like? Whether it's DV, sex assault, or combined, right? So we can also play into the betrayal part, or just frustration at how come you haven't left? How come you haven't left this horrible relationship? How many, and sometimes we ask really crappy question, well, how many more times do you want to get raped? How many more times do you want to get hit? How many more times this? I know, Vaughn, I saw your face on that, but I'm just saying, like sometimes the questions can be in the brain, but they shouldn't leave the mouth, right? I think we can all agree on that. You can think whatever you want, just don't have it, pass your lips. There's betrayal on many facets when it comes to sexual assault or DV platform, period, because it's individual. It's trust, it's familial, it's cultural, it's, it just goes on and on and on. And then, there's beyond that, the trauma bonds that happen within those relationships, that add a layer of complexity. And many times a person who is an adult survivor of sexual assault, there may have been, like you talked about, some childhood exposure to molestation, to familial patterns of abuse. I mean, it's just, it's just a tragedy, really. But there's also the part where law enforcement plays a little bit of a part in supporting that person and supporting them whenever they choose to report. Because sometimes we're also like the classic question, although I think we're getting better, what took you so long? Do you really have to think about that? And I don't, if you didn't report it 24 hours after and it took you 3 weeks to get up the courage or whatever that looks like, it's, but that's that training and normalization of sometimes people, how long is it taken for some people to disclose? Let's be honest. That's why there's no statute of limitations on most criminal stuff under 18, right? You don't turn 18, your brain's not magical. You don't disclose just because you've turned 18. A lot of people don't disclose till after age 30, after age 35. Some people not till they're 50. You know what I'm saying? So sexual assault is so complex from the betrayal aspect.
We used to ask we would ask our commanders that. They would say, what took her so long? And my go-to response at that point was, well, most sexual assault victims never report. So reporting 2 years after the event when compared to never is pretty fast.
Right.
I don't know. I'm not sure what you were expecting, but yeah, you guys hit betrayal from a lot of different angles relative to the trauma. Nicole and I are talking betrayal a lot about the agency conveying to the victims or conveying to the officer a betrayal of the agency.
Yeah, organizational betrayal is huge and justified, righteous. And I don't like to say the good shoot because I don't really like that term. I mean, again, officers have done what we've asked of them under rapidly unfolding, extremely fluid, stressful circumstances, right? And we tend to see, right, wrong, or indifferent, I'm just going to say for what it is, weak leadership. And I wouldn't even call it leadership, but they're abandoning their officers in many layers to the point where now this is anecdotal at best. I've just started pulling some limited data from my colleagues who are first responder psychologists, first responder therapists, and whatnot. What a common thread seems to be is the officers are working through their event and quickly is up to the individual healing. Okay. And so quickly for that person, they're working through that event. But one of the big hurdles is agency betrayal in that process. That is a barrier to post-traumatic healing, because if you are not supported through something like that by your agency, it's very, very damaging. Especially, we know there's going to be civil litigation many times, regardless of how the shoot looks. And, depending on the state and political climate, there may be criminal, litigation as well and whatnot. But, there recently, I won't call it any departments, but there was a shooting and the chief was apologizing within, 6 hours for the shooting. There's no investigation. How are you apologizing for something we don't even know? It hasn't even been fleshed out yet. So you've already tossed your officers to the wolves. So agency betrayal is huge. And I want you to think about really officers' mindsets. They go to work for somewhere. In some cases, they enjoy their agency. I mean, I don't think we should ever love an agency. Like an agency back to us is incapable of emotion. And it kind of goes in the same thing. I think it was Dave Smith that said it, no agency ever died in the line of duty. So you have to be, as an individual, like, what is it for you and what do you bring to the table? And you have to have really healthy boundaries when it comes to that. But the weakness at the top, and sometimes the judgment from our brethren who maybe don't have the same exposure to human performance, human limitations, a robust understanding of force encounters. Sometimes we throw the rest of our people to the wolves. And so there can be betrayal in a lot of areas there, but I can say, and then again, anecdotally, I was kicking around this for my dissertation. I'm not married to it yet, but looking at like long-term effects of agency betrayal in the post-traumatic healing process for officers involved in critical incidents, because it seems to be a problem. And that's huge.
That does it for part one of my interview of Nicole Florisi and Kliem. Be sure to tune in next week for the powerful conclusion to this interview. You won't want to miss it. Thank you for listening in to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories. Your participation in listening will hopefully inspire you to do all you can to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. Please share this episode with everyone you know. It may be just the thing that someone in your life needs to hear today. Be sure to subscribe and rate the podcast. It helps get the word out, because we all know someone whose life has been affected by rape or sexual assault. And remember to start by believing. We'll see you next week.